What would you do if a complete stranger changed your life in an instant? Jake never expected that a simple pizza delivery would lead to the biggest moment of his life. One minute he was struggling to pay for his sister's surgery. The next, Shaquille O'Neal was standing in front of him, offering more than just a tip. But it wasn't just the money. It was what happened next that shocked the world. This isn't just a story about generosity. It's about how one act of kindness can create a ripple effect that touches millions. And it all started with a knock on a hotel room door. Hey, real quick, before we get into this wild story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes darting toward the glowing fuel gauge. Nearly empty. His heart sank. If he didn't make enough tips tonight, his sister's surgery might have to wait. Again, Jake exhaled sharply, his breath fogging up the windshield of his beat-up 2007 Honda Civic. He had been delivering pizzas for nearly 10 hours straight, running from one address to another with barely a break. His feet ached, his back screamed in protest, and his stomach rumbled. A reminder that he hadn't eaten since noon. But none of that mattered. Every single dollar he made was for Emma, his little sister, his entire world. At just 10 years old, Emma had already spent more time in hospital rooms than in playgrounds. Her upcoming surgery was critical, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavy on Jake's shoulders. He was only 22, still figuring out life himself, but quitting wasn't an option, not when she was counting on him. With a quick glance at the order details on his phone, he muttered, "Fancy hotel. Great. Another rich guy who probably won't tip." Still, he forced a polite expression onto his face and pulled into the parking lot of the Lux Grand Hotel, one of the most expensive places in the city. He could barely afford a cup of coffee from their lobby, let alone a night in one of their extravagant suites. Clutching the pizza box in one hand, Jake adjusted his cap and walked toward the entrance. His uniform was wrinkled and his shoes were scuffed, a sharp contrast to the marble floors and crystal chandeliers inside the hotel. The elevator ride to the penthouse suite felt surreal. As the numbers climbed, so did his nerves. "Maybe I'll get lucky," he mumbled under his breath. Finally, he reached room 2501. Taking a deep breath, he knocked twice. Silence. Then the door swung open. Jake's heart nearly stopped. A giant stood in the doorway. Jake had seen this man countless times before, on television, in commercials, on magazine covers. Shaquille O'Neal. For a split second, Jake forgot how to breathe. He had just delivered a pizza to a basketball legend. Shaq's presence was even more intimidating in person. He towered over Jake, his broad frame nearly filling the doorway, but his face was warm, friendly. Not the cold, uninterested stare Jake usually got from rich customers. Shaq glanced at the pizza box, then back at Jake, his eyes sharp, observant. "You look tired, kid," he said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Long shift." Jake nodded dumbly. He had no idea that this delivery was about to change his life. Before Jake could respond, Shaq reached into his pocket, and what he pulled out made Jake's jaw drop. Jake's mind struggled to process what was happening. Standing in front of him was Shaquille O'Neal, the legend himself. Why was a multi-millionaire NBA icon ordering pizza like a regular guy? For a moment, Jake felt frozen. The exhaustion from his shift, the stress about his sister's surgery, all of it faded as he processed the towering figure in front of him. He had seen Shaq on TV, in commercials, and even in viral videos. But now he was here, holding a pizza, looking up at a living legend. Shaq grinned. "Man, you look like you just saw a ghost." Jake blinked rapidly, clearing his throat. Sorry, sir. Here's your order." He quickly handed over the pizza, still gripping the receipt, waiting for the usual forced "thank you" or empty pocket pat-down. But Shaq did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and placed it in Jake's hand. Jake stared at the money, eyes wide. This had to be a mistake. "Sir, I think you gave me too much," Jake stammered, his fingers trembling as he held the bill. His usual tips barely covered a tank of gas. This was insane. Shaq chuckled, crossing his arms. "No mistake, kid." His deep voice was calm but firm. "Actually," he reached into his pocket again, pulled out another 100, and placed it on top of the first. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. $200? For a pizza delivery? This wasn't normal. This wasn't how deliveries worked. Usually, rich customers barely tipped at all, or they'd give a sarcastic smirk before closing the door. Why was Shaq different? Why, why are you doing this? Jake blurted out before he could stop himself. Shaq smiled. Not a cocky, I'm rich kind of smile, but a genuine warm one. I believe in taking care of people who work hard, he said simply, and I can tell you've been hustling. Jake swallowed hard. He had been hustling, every second of every day, but no one had ever noticed before. No one had ever cared. He looked down at the money, then back up at Shaq. Thank you. You have no idea how much this means. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his eyes studying Jake carefully. Actually, I think I do. Something about the way he said it made Jake's stomach twist. It was like Shaq could see right through him. Shaq's eyes dropped to the worn-out photo taped to Jake's delivery bag, a picture of a little girl with bright blue eyes and a tired but hopeful smile. Shaq pointed at it. Who's this? Jake hesitated. Most people didn't ask. Most people didn't care. But something told him that Shaq did. My sister, Jake said quietly. His voice wavered. Her name's Emma. Shaq's expression changed. The light-hearted grin faded, replaced by something deeper, something personal. Jake barely noticed his own hands shaking. Shaq's voice softened. She's sick? Jake nodded, his throat tightening. Shaq took a deep breath, his massive shoulders rising and falling. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the room. Jake stood there, confused. What just happened? Was Shaq upset? Did he say something wrong? And more importantly, why did it feel like Shaq was about to do something even crazier? Jake's fingers tightened around the two crisp $100 bills. He had never held this much tip money in his hands before. Not in one night, let alone in one delivery. His mind spun with questions. Why was Shaq being so generous? Jake's instincts screamed at him to say, thank you, take the money, and leave. But something in Shaq's expression stopped him. The basketball legend's eyes weren't just looking at him anymore. They were studying him. Then Shaq's gaze dropped lower, to the faded, slightly crumpled photo taped to the side of Jake's insulated pizza bag. A young girl, barely 7 years old, smiling brightly, despite looking tired. Shaq frowned and pointed at the picture. Who's this? Jake felt his stomach twist. Most people never asked. Most customers just ignored it. Some delivery guys teased him about it, telling him it looked unprofessional. But Jake never took it off, because every time he looked at it, he remembered why he was doing this. He swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. He didn't like talking about it, but this was Shaq. My sister, Jake said quietly. Her name's Emma. Shaq tilted his head, his massive frame leaning slightly forward. How old is she? 7. Shaq's jaw clenched. He nodded slowly, like he was piecing something together in his head. She your only sibling? Jake hesitated before nodding. Yeah, it's just me and her now. Shaq exhaled sharply, his expression unreadable. Your parents? Jake's throat tightened. He had repeated this story too many times. To doctors, to social workers, to people who always said they cared but never really did. They passed away a few years ago, Jake admitted, staring at the floor. Car accident. Shaq didn't react the way most people did. There was no awkward apology, no pitying, oh man, I'm so sorry. Instead, Shaq simply asked, and you take care of her? Jake forced a small smile. I try. Shaq's eyes flickered toward the money still in Jake's hand. That why you're working this job? Jake nodded, his grip tightening around the bills. Her surgery's expensive. I've been saving up, but... He let out a humorless laugh. At this rate, I don't know if I'll ever get there. Shaq was silent for a moment, then glanced at the hotel room behind him. Something shifted in his expression. For the first time since opening the door, he wasn't smiling anymore. His usual playful, light-hearted energy was gone. Instead, he looked serious, focused, like Jake's words had hit him in a way he didn't expect. Jake immediately regretted saying anything. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want Shaq to feel bad for him. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Shaq suddenly lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Wait here. Jake blinked. What? Shaq didn't respond. He just turned around and disappeared into his hotel room. Jake stood there, heart racing. What just happened? Had he said something wrong? Was Shaq offended? Or was he about to do something even crazier? Shaq took a deep breath, his expression shifting from curiosity to something far more serious. This wasn't the first time he had met someone struggling to save a loved one. Jake shuffled awkwardly, his fingers still clenched around the crisp bills Shaq had given him. The hotel hallway was quiet, aside from the distant hum of city traffic outside. Shaq leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his towering presence making Jake feel even smaller than usual. But the look in Shaq's eyes wasn't one of pity. It was something deeper. So, Shaq exhaled, nodding toward the pizza bag with the faded picture of Emma taped to it. Tell me about her. Jake hesitated. He had told this story too many times before. Most people just listened with polite sympathy before moving on, offering nothing but empty words. But Shaq, he seemed different. Jake cleared his throat, pushing past the lump forming there. She's 7, smart as hell, loves space, science. She says she wants to be an astronaut. Shaq grinned slightly. An astronaut, huh? Jake nodded. Yeah, says she wants to go to Mars. For a brief moment, Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. That's a big dream. She's a big dreamer, Jake admitted, his smile fading. Or, at least she was. Shaq's grin disappeared. Was? Jake looked down at the floor, his fingers tightening into a fist. She's sick, he said quietly. Real sick. The air between them grew heavy. Shaq stayed silent, letting Jake continue at his own pace. She was diagnosed about a year ago, some kind of congenital heart defect. Doctors said she needed surgery, but Jake laughed bitterly. Turns out, life-saving surgery isn't cheap. Shaq's jaw tightened. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I've been working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, trying to keep up with the hospital bills. I've sold everything I could. My car, my dad's old watch, even my mom's jewelry. He swallowed hard. I promised Emma I'd fix this, that I'd get her the surgery no matter what. Jake let out a shaky breath and looked up at Shaq. But I'm running out of time. For a long moment, Shaq didn't say anything. Then slowly he nodded. You remind me of someone. Jake frowned. Who? Shaq's eyes darkened, memories flickering across his face. My mom, he finally said. She worked 3 jobs when I was a kid, did everything she could to put food on the table. Jake blinked, surprised. Really? I mean, you're Shaquille O'Neal. I just assumed, Shaq smirked slightly, that I was always rich. He shook his head. Nah, man, we struggled. Hard. Jake remained quiet, sensing there was more to the story. My mom used to tell me, it's not about what you have, it's about what you do with what you have. Shaq paused, his eyes flickering to the picture of Emma again. And right now you're doing everything you can with what little you have. Jake swallowed, his chest feeling too tight. Shaq straightened up, taking a deep breath. Then without another word, he turned on his heel. Jake frowned. Wait, where are you going? Shaq threw a hand up as he walked back into his hotel room. Hold up, I'll be right back. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding. What was Shaq about to do? Jake shifted nervously, shifting from one foot to the other. Did I say too much? Had he overstepped? Should he have just thanked Shaq for the tip and left? He didn't know what to expect next, but one thing was clear. Shaq wasn't done. Shaq had disappeared into his hotel room, leaving Jake standing alone in the dimly lit hallway. Jake rubbed his palms together, suddenly aware of how sweaty they were. A bellhop pushed a cart of towels down the hall, giving him a curious glance, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was racing. Why had Shaq left so suddenly? Was he getting more money? No, that didn't make sense. He had already been way too generous. Maybe he had just stepped away to avoid an awkward conversation. Maybe Shaq had heard enough and didn't want to get involved any further. Jake's stomach twisted at the thought. I shouldn't have told him everything. Just as Jake was considering walking away, the door swung open again. Shaq stepped out, holding a plain white envelope in his massive hand. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Shaq's expression was unreadable, but there was a certain knowing look in his eyes. He held out the envelope. Here, open it. Jake hesitated before reaching out and taking it with slightly trembling fingers. The paper felt thick, heavier than it should have been. His pulse pounded in his ears as he carefully peeled the flap open. What was inside changed everything. Jake's eyes widened. His breath hitched. He nearly dropped the envelope. Inside was a check, but not just any check. Jake's throat went dry as he stared at the number written on it. $10,000. The world tilted. He blinked, convinced he was imagining things. There's no way this is real. His fingers tightened around the paper as he forced himself to look at it again. Yep, still there. The number didn't change. He looked up at Shaq, completely at a loss for words. Sir, I can't. Shaq cut him off with a casual shrug. You already did. Jake felt his knees go weak. Tears burned the back of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. This is too much, he finally choked out. I can't accept this. Shaq grinned, arms crossed over his chest. Why not? Jake struggled to find the right words. I mean, I'm just a pizza guy. You don't even know me. Shaq's expression softened. I don't have to know you, he said. I know what it's like to struggle, and I know when someone deserves a break. Jake was speechless. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. But before he could even process what had just happened, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jake pulled it out, his stomach dropping, when he saw the caller ID. It was the hospital. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the check, his vision blurring. Was this real? The number written on it made his stomach flip. $10,000. His fingers gripped the paper tighter, as if it might disappear at any moment. His heart pounded. This was more money than he had ever held in his life. It could change everything. It could save his sister. But how could he accept something so big? Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked up at Shaq, his voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I can't take this. Shaq, leaning against the hotel doorway with his arms crossed, grinned. You already did, he said with a playful shrug. Jake let out a shaky laugh, but the weight of the situation still pressed down on him. He felt dizzy. This wasn't just a big tip. This was a miracle. But I didn't do anything to deserve this, Jake admitted, his voice cracking. Shaq's smile softened. You bust your ass every night delivering pizzas to take care of your sister, he said. If that's not deserving, I don't know what is. Jake clenched his jaw, trying to keep himself together. The past few years had been nothing but struggle. Long shifts, sleepless nights, skipped meals just to save a little extra for Emma's hospital bills. And now this? It felt unreal. His fingers curled around the check, but guilt gnawed at him. I don't know how to thank you, he admitted. This is life-changing. Shaq let out a low chuckle. Then don't thank me, he said simply. Just promise me one thing. When you're in a position to help someone, you do it. Jake swallowed, nodding quickly. I swear, he said. I will. For the first time in years, he actually believed it. Maybe one day he wouldn't just be the guy struggling to make ends meet. Maybe one day he'd be the one helping someone else. But before he could let that thought sink in, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jake's stomach dropped. His hands, still shaking, fumbled as he pulled it out. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the caller ID. His throat tightened. He glanced up at Shaq, his face draining of color. Shaq's smile faded instantly. What is it? Shaq asked, stepping closer. Jake's fingers hovered over the answer button, his chest tightening with fear. He knew what this call meant. It wasn't good news. Jake took a deep breath and pressed answer. Hello? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. A pause. Then, Jake, we need to talk about your sister. Jake's heart plummeted the moment he heard the doctor's voice on the other end of the line. His grip tightened on his phone, his knuckles turning white. Mr. Carter, the doctor said, his tone urgent. We need to talk about Emma. Jake's stomach twisted. Not now. Please, not now. His entire body tensed as he stepped away from Shaq, who watched him closely. I'm here, Jake stammered. What's going on? The doctor sighed. Her condition is getting worse. The infection is spreading faster than we expected. Jake felt like he had been punched in the gut. What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It means we need to move up the surgery, the doctor explained. We can't wait anymore. If we don't operate soon, we might not be able to save her. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Number, no, no, no. His legs wobbled and he reached out, gripping the doorframe for support. How soon? He asked, his voice cracking. As soon as tomorrow morning, the doctor said. But there's a problem. The hospital won't proceed without a confirmed payment. Jake's heart dropped. He looked down at the check from Shaq, still clutched tightly in his other hand. $10,000. It was a miracle, but it still wasn't enough. How much? Jake forced himself to ask. There was a pause. The total cost is $40,000, the doctor finally said. Jake's knees nearly buckled. $40,000. He squeezed his eyes shut, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had barely managed to scrape by for months. How was he supposed to come up with an extra $30,000 overnight? Jake, the doctor said. He swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. I'll figure it out. Please do, the doctor said, because if we don't operate soon, she won't make it. The call disconnected. For a moment, Jake just stood there, staring at his phone, frozen. Then his entire body trembled. His little sister, his world, was slipping away, and he was helpless. A lump formed in his throat, but he refused to break. Not yet. He took a shaky breath and turned back to Shaq. The NBA legend was still standing there, arms crossed, watching him with concern. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. Shaq took a step closer. That was about your sister, wasn't it? Jake nodded, his lips pressed together so tightly they hurt. Shaq studied him for a moment, then glanced at the check in Jake's hand. I take it that's not enough, Shaq said softly. Jake clenched his jaw. No, he admitted. It's not. Shaq exhaled through his nose, rubbing his chin. How much do you need? Jake hesitated, ashamed to say it out loud. 30,000, he finally muttered. Shaq didn't even blink. All right, he said, pulling out his phone. Let's make some calls. Jake's breath caught. Was this really happening? Before he could process it, Shaq had already dialed a number. Yo, Shaq said into the phone. I need a favor. Jake's heart raced. Was this the moment that would save his sister's life? Shaq saw the fear in Jake's eyes. The kid was trying to stay strong, but Shaq could see it. The desperation, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He'd seen that look before. He'd felt it before. Jake's hands trembled as he held the check for $10,000, but it wasn't enough. Not even close. Shaq took a deep breath, then placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. How much do you need? Jake hesitated, swallowing hard. His voice was barely a whisper. 30,000. Silence hung between them. Shaq didn't flinch, didn't ask questions, didn't even blink. Instead, he nodded once, pulled out his phone, and muttered, All right, let's make some calls. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Wait, what? Shaq stepped away, pressing a number on his phone. Jake could hear the ringing. Each second felt like a lifetime. Then someone picked up. Yo, Shaq said, his deep voice casual but firm. I need a favor. Jake stood frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. Who was he calling? What was happening? Shaq turned his back slightly, listening. Yeah, man, I got a kid here. Hardworking, doing everything for his little sister, Shaq explained. She needs surgery. Tomorrow. Jake's stomach twisted. Tomorrow. Shaq listened for a moment, then chuckled. Come on, you know I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. Jake stared at the ground, his hands clenched into fists. This felt surreal. He had spent months begging banks for loans, pleading with charities, praying for a miracle. Now Shaquille O'Neal, a basketball legend, was making phone calls for him. Shaq paced slowly, listening to whoever was on the other end. Nah, I don't need a loan. I need the bill paid. In full. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He felt his knees go weak. Shaq nodded, giving a low hum. Yeah? All right. What do I gotta do? Jake's stomach twisted into knots. What if this didn't work? What if the hospital still said no? Then Shaq laughed. A big, booming laugh. Man, that's why I love you. You always come through. Jake's hands were sweating. Shaq turned back toward him, grinning. It's done, he said simply. Jake blinked. What? Shaq put his phone away. I called someone who called someone. Long story short, your sister's surgery is paid for. Jake's entire world tilted. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. His chest tightened as he stared at Shaq, trying to process the words. Sir, I... Tears burned his eyes. Shaq clapped him on the back. Relax, kid. She's gonna be all right. Jake sucked in a sharp breath. He wanted to drop to his knees, scream, cry, hug Shaq. Instead, he covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. Shaq sighed, giving him a moment. Then he said softly, Take a deep breath, Jake. Jake did, inhaling shakily, then exhaling slowly. This was real. It was happening. Emma was going to get the surgery. Shaq had just saved his sister's life. Jake wiped his eyes, still in shock. Shaq grinned. Now, let's go tell your sister the good news. Jake's legs finally moved, but as they stepped outside, his phone rang again. Jake's heart stopped. Had something gone wrong? Jake's phone buzzed. He looked down at the screen, then froze. For a second, he thought he had read it wrong. His heart pounded as he scanned the notification again. Hospital payment. Paid in full. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His knees nearly gave out. This couldn't be real. The moment everything changed. His fingers trembled as he held up the phone, staring at the message. Shaq, still standing beside him, tilted his head. Well? Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed hard, then tried again. Sir, it says... His voice cracked. It says the hospital bill is paid. Shaq grinned. Told ya. Jake stumbled backward, gripping the nearest wall for support. His chest felt tight, his legs shaky. His entire world had just shifted in a matter of minutes. Sir, I don't... Tears blurred his vision. Shaq chuckled, patting him on the back. Deep breaths, kid. Jake tried, but his body wasn't cooperating. He was too overwhelmed. How? How did this happen so fast? Shaq had made a few calls, and just like that, Emma was getting her surgery. No more begging, no more debt, no more sleepless nights wondering if he'd lose his sister. Jake pressed a fist to his mouth, trying to hold back a sob, but it was too much. He broke. Right there in front of Shaquille O'Neal, in the middle of a hotel hallway, Jake cried. Shaq let him have his moment. He didn't rush him, didn't tell him to toughen up. Instead, he gave him a minute to breathe. When Jake finally looked up, eyes red and puffy, Shaq smiled. You good? Jake nodded quickly, wiping his face. I don't know how to thank you. Shaq shrugged. You don't gotta thank me, kid. Just take care of your sister. Jake's breath hitched again. I will. I swear. Shaq's smile softened. I know you will. There was no doubt in Shaq's voice. That meant something to Jake. For years, people had doubted him, told him he was too young to raise his sister, too broke to make it work. But Shaq believed in him. A brother's promise. Jake sniffled, gripping his phone like a lifeline. I'm gonna tell her right now. Shaq nodded. You should. She deserves to know she's got a big brother who'd move mountains for her. Jake's chest tightened at those words, because it was true. He had spent every second of his life trying to make sure Emma had a chance. And now, because of Shaq, she did. Jake's fingers flew across his phone screen as he typed out a text to Emma. Sis, guess what? You're getting the surgery. It's happening. He barely had time to hit send before his phone rang. Emma. Jake's heart pounded as he answered. Jake? Her voice was small, hesitant. He grinned through his tears. Hey, Em. What do you mean it's happening? Jake's throat tightened. I mean, it's paid for. You're getting the surgery. Silence. Then a tiny gasp. Then, sobbing. Jake clenched his jaw, swallowing hard. He let her cry. He understood. This was everything they had prayed for. Finally, Emma whispered, "How?" Jake glanced at Shaq. The big man gave him a wink. Jake smiled. "I had some help." Jake pulled the phone from his ear as Emma kept crying on the other end. Shaq smirked. "Well, kid, ready to make this official?" Jake wiped his tears, nodding. Shaq pulled out his car keys. "Then let's get to the hospital." Jake wiped his face with his sleeve, his fingers still trembling. How is this real? Just hours ago, he had been stressing over whether he'd make enough money to put gas in his car. And now Shaquille O'Neal, a living legend, had just changed his life forever. But as much as Jake wanted to break down in gratitude, Shaq wasn't the kind of man who wanted tears. "You don't need to thank me, kid," Shaq said, flashing that signature grin. "Just promise me one thing." Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Anything." Shaq's expression turned serious as he placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "When your sister gets better," he said, voice steady, "promise me you'll keep pushing forward." Jake's heart clenched. This wasn't just about the money. Shaq saw him, not just as a delivery driver, not just as a struggling kid, but as a fighter, and he wanted to make sure that fight didn't stop. Jake blinked quickly, nodding. "I swear, I won't stop." Shaq studied him for a second longer, as if searching his face for doubt. Then, he pulled him into a hug. It wasn't a quick, half-hearted hug. It was solid. It was the kind of hug that said, "You're not alone anymore." Jake's breath hitched. For years, he had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every bill, every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, wondering if he'd ever be able to give Emma the life she deserved. And for the first time, someone helped him carry it. Shaq pulled back, shaking Jake's shoulders a little. "And one more thing," he said, his grin returning. Jake sniffed and laughed weakly. "Yeah?" Shaq smirked. "When Emma's better, you take her out for a real meal. No more pizza." Jake let out a genuine laugh, nodding. "Deal." Shaq gave him a final clap on the back before turning toward the elevator. Jake stood there, his chest still tight with emotion, watching the man who had just changed everything walk away. But just before Shaq stepped inside, he paused. Jake's breath caught as Shaq turned back toward him, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Hey, Jake." Jake straightened. "Yeah?" Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out something small and tossed it. Jake barely caught it in time, his fingers closing around something cold and metallic. He looked down. His breath stopped. It was a car key. Jake's head snapped up, his eyes darting from Shaq to the key and back again. Wait, what?" Shaq just grinned as the elevator doors began to close. "Go check the parking lot, kid." And then, he was gone. Jake sat beside Emma's hospital bed, gently holding her tiny hand in his. "You're gonna be okay," he whispered, forcing a smile. "It's finally happening." Emma, just 10 years old, looked up at him with tired but hopeful eyes. She was pale, her small body weak from months of sickness. But today was the day. The day that had felt impossible for so long. The day her life would finally change. Jake had spent years dreaming about this moment, praying for a miracle. And then, Shaq happened. But even now, as the surgery loomed just minutes away, Jake felt a pang of nervousness. What if something went wrong? What if... He shook his head. Think positive. Emma needs you to be strong." He squeezed her hand a little tighter. She smiled sleepily at him. Then, the door creaked open. Jake turned, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing in the doorway, grinning like he had all the time in the world, was Shaquille O'Neal. Jake blinked, certain he was imagining it. "Yo, kid," Shaq said, stepping inside. "Mind if I crash the party?" Jake's jaw dropped. "What? You're here?" Shaq chuckled. "Of course I'm here. You think I was gonna miss this?" Emma gasped weakly, her eyes lighting up for the first time in weeks. "Oh, my God," she whispered. "You're huge." Shaq laughed, walking over to her bedside. "You know, that's what everyone says." Jake was still in shock. "How? Why?" Shaq shrugged like it was the simplest thing in the world. Had to see my favorite pizza guy in action. And your little sister? She's the real MVP, Emma giggled softly, her fingers twitching in Jake's hand. Shaq lowered himself to sit beside her. How you feeling, champ? Emma thought about it for a second. Kinda nervous, she admitted. Shaq nodded solemnly. Yeah, I get that. You know what I do when I'm nervous? She shook her head. Shaq leaned in like he was about to tell her a big secret. I pretend I'm a superhero, he said. Because superheroes? They always win. Emma's eyes widened. I can be a superhero? Absolutely, Shaq said. And guess what? I brought you something to prove it. Jake frowned. Wait, what? Shaq reached into the pocket of his oversized hoodie and pulled out a tiny blue cape. Emma gasped. No way, she whispered. Shaq draped the cape over her little shoulders. Boom. Super Emma. Emma's face glowed. Jake swallowed hard. He hadn't seen his sister this happy in months. Shaq leaned back, watching Emma adjust her new cape with pride. Then he turned to Jake. How you holding up, kid? Jake exhaled, rubbing his face. I mean, it's been a lot, but thanks to you, we made it. Shaq studied him for a second. I gotta say, Jake, you remind me of me. Jake blinked. What? Shaq nodded. See, when I was a kid, my mom worked her butt off. She struggled. A lot. But she never gave up. And neither did you. Jake swallowed the lump in his throat. Shaq's voice softened. That's why I had to help. Jake clenched his jaw, his emotions nearly overwhelming him. You didn't have to, though. That's what blows my mind. You didn't owe me anything. Shaq grinned. Nah, man. See, that's where you're wrong. Jake frowned. What do you mean? Shaq gestured toward Emma. Because one day she's going to grow up, and she's going to see what her big brother did for her. She's going to know that when things got hard, you didn't quit. Jake's eyes burned with unshed tears. And then one day, Shaq continued, someone's going to need her help. And you know what she'll do? Jake's voice was barely a whisper. She'll help them. Shaq nodded. Exactly. That's why I did it. Because kindness doesn't stop. It keeps going. Forever. Jake wiped his face, completely overwhelmed. Shaq clapped him on the shoulder. Now, you ready for the good news? Jake sniffed, laughing weakly. There's more good news? Shaq smirked. Of course, man. You think I came here empty-handed? He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out an envelope. Jake's stomach flipped. What is that? He asked cautiously. Shaq winked. Open it and see. Jake hesitated. Then with shaking fingers, he tore open the envelope. Inside was a college scholarship. For him. Jake's entire world stopped. He looked up at Shaq, completely speechless. Shaq just grinned. Told you, kid. This is just the beginning. Jake thought his life had already changed forever. He was wrong. It was about to become something even bigger. A hospital nurse, standing quietly in the corner, had been filming the entire exchange. Jake's tears, Emma's superhero cape, and Shaq's final, unbelievable surprise. The moment was too powerful not to be shared. She uploaded it with a simple caption. A delivery driver just got the surprise of a lifetime, thanks to Shaq. Within hours, the world took notice. Jake woke up the next morning to find his phone buzzing nonstop. Texts, calls, voicemails, social media notifications exploding. He frowned, rubbing his eyes. What the? His best friend Nate called first. Dude, Nate blurted out, practically screaming. You're all over the internet. Jake sat up, heart pounding. Wait, what? Nate sent him a link. Jake clicked it and froze. The video had already hit 2 million views. The comments section was flooded. This man was working nonstop to save his sister, and then Shaq just changed his life? I'm not crying, you're crying. We need more people like Shaq in this world. Where's the GoFundMe for this guy? I want to help. Jake's hands shook. What? What is happening? He whispered. But it was just the beginning. By the afternoon, major news outlets had picked up the story. CNN, NBC, ESPN, even Good Morning America. They all ran the same headline. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal secretly pays for young girl's surgery and changes her brother's life. Jake and Emma's story was everywhere. People from all over the world were donating money, sending messages, and offering help. A famous talk show host reached out, inviting Jake onto her show. "I don't get it," Jake muttered, staring at the overwhelming response. Why, why are people doing this? Shaq, sitting beside him in the hospital waiting room, chuckled. "Because kindness, my guy," Shaq said. "It spreads like wildfire." Jake swallowed hard. "But I didn't do anything." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "You didn't?" He leaned forward. "You worked day and night to take care of your sister," Shaq said. "You sacrificed everything for her. You never gave up." Jake looked away, emotion swelling in his chest. "That," Shaq finished, "is why people care." A few days later, Emma's surgery was a complete success. Jake sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as she slowly woke up. Emma blinked, her big eyes adjusting to the light. "Jake?" she whispered. Jake smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "Hey, Super Emma," she giggled softly. "Did I win?" Jake laughed, wiping away a tear. "Yeah, kiddo, you won." The moment was captured on video by a nurse and shared once again. This time, the world celebrated with them. A week later, Jake and Shaq sat together for an interview. A journalist leaned forward, looking at Shaq. "Shaq, I have to ask, why? Why do you do things like this? What drives you?" Shaq smiled thoughtfully. "I grew up watching my mom struggle," he said. "I know what it's like to want something so bad, but feel like it's just out of reach." He glanced at Jake. "And I believe in family." The interviewer nodded. "So, what's next for you, Jake?" Jake exhaled, thinking. Then he smiled. "I'm going to pay it forward." Shaq grinned. "That's what I like to hear. Because at the end of the day, that's what family does.